Well, today on the show, I'm joined by David Alnwick. David is a performance artist who specializes in stage shows and the realm of magic. I wanted to have David on today to talk about the power of magic, its ability to influence us as individuals as we sit in an audience and get taken along on a psychological journey as the performer stands before us and shows us things that bend the mind, so to speak. Anyway, this conversation, I hope, is going to be getting behind magic, ritual, and illusion and expose this entire space in a fascinating way. If it's your first time checking out the show, I'd ask you to hit the subscribe button. Then if you're on YouTube, select the bell notification icon. That's going to remind you whenever we release a video here on the channel. If you wouldn't mind giving it a thumbs up and then sharing it with your friends, your family, your followers, as I always say, we grow because you, as our audience, take the time to share the conversations that you enjoy. So I hope you enjoy this one and I hope you share it. Okay, enough of that. Here's my conversation with David Alnwick. Cheers. Hello and welcome to the show. My name's Samuel. Today I'm joined by David Alnwick. David, it's great to have you on the show.
A genuine pleasure.
I've been looking forward to this conversation for a little while now. I want to kind of dive into, I guess, the philosophy behind magic, ritual, and illusion. So I thought the great person to speak to would be yourself, being a stage magician. So I guess as we begin to have this conversation, it might be useful if you can give the audience just a little background into what you currently do in that space.
Sure. It's a big question because without trying to sound massively full of myself, which I definitely am, but without trying to sound like that, I do stuff that the vast majority of magicians don't. Like what I do it's relatively unique. And in order to describe what I do, I need to sort of I don't want to say get to first principles, but so I started by just being a kid doing card tricks, as pretty much every magician is, right? And then you grow up. I did an acting degree, which was fun. I wanted to be an actor for a bit, and then I did a lot of and then I did the Edinburgh Fringe Festival immediately when we graduated, and I kept doing that every year. I've been doing that for the last 14 years, which is the biggest sort of theatre festival in the world. Happens in Edinburgh. Incredible thing. And I was living in Liverpool at the time, and I was doing just comedy clubs and doing magic at comedy clubs. So I got very, very comfortable being on stage. And I'd already trained as an actor. It was a space that I felt very at home, being on stage in front of people. And I could be pretty funny. I was never very good at writing jokes, but I could be pretty good. And then I was doing a lot of restaurants and a lot of weddings and some corporate events, which I'd say is probably about 90%, if not 95, maybe even higher percent of what most professional magicians do, because they're very commercial gigs, private work and stuff. But after a certain amount of time, the stage shows in Edinburgh, because when you're in Edinburgh, you're just doing stage shows, and I do a lot. I do 3 shows a day, which is quite a bit. It's kind of normal for me, but it is quite a bit. They started becoming successful enough that I could support myself just doing stage, and so I stepped away from doing the close-up. And for a while, I was just doing comedy magic on stage, and I was good at it. And I felt like I feel like I can comfortably say that I was operating at a pretty high level, but I couldn't get anywhere with it. There's nowhere I could go with it. People were saying, "Oh, do Britain's Got Talent," but I knew I didn't want to do any of that. And I was thinking, man, I feel like I've peaked, and there's just no world for a magician. But then something happened where I discovered, one of my friends a really good magician, Chris. He was doing some stuff that was inspired by like the works of Bo Burnham, and there's a few other sort of artists around that time, comedians, musical comedians, which in a sense, are similar to magic. That they're just one person on stage. There's no fourth wall. There's a sort of a narrative between them and the audience. You know what I mean? Um, we're really doing some like, I mean, I won't go, watch Bo Burnham. I'm sure you have. Um, really like interesting artistic pursuits, like different kinds of theatrical narrative within the work, really high levels of craft. And when I saw that, I was like, what would my version of that look like? So I had a go. In 2018, I did a show, and it was a very like emotional show, which sounds kind of, you know, silly. I always feel a bit silly saying that, which is funny because like most other artists, like a musician or even an actor, if they were talking about, oh yeah, I channeled this trauma or something, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's normal. But for a magician, it kind of sounds silly because there's not really a lot of examples of magicians doing that beyond giving a sob story at the beginning of a talent show, which is a bit, sounds a bit crass, but it's kind of true, right? Like I realized that I was doing the work. It was a big part of the reason I was intimidated to be quite authentic on stage. But then when I did that, it got a really good response, and authenticity is a big part of it. Like I knew if I did it, the only way it would work if it was authentic, and that took me a while to get over. And then I started writing the next one because I knew I didn't want to just kind of be the guy who mines his past for that kind of performance. And I thought, well, I'll do it in a fictional sense. And then the pandemic happened, and I spent, obviously I couldn't perform, but I spent my whole time reading. I thought, I'm going to read these books that, like, I've been told are like these great works of magic, but no one really reads. There's a few books like Our Magic by Devant and Maskelyne, which was written in like sort of 19. God, when was that written? Like 1913, maybe, or maybe even 1900 something. Like early on, kind of when magic was in a very different space. Theater was a very different industry back then. And then there's Magic and Showmanship by Henning Nelms, written sort of in the, I forget, like 50s, 60s. That's a guess. I think 60s. Um, and I started finding people, and I like in these works, going, oh wow, these guys are actually thinking about magic the same as I am. Like I've realized there are these giants whose shoulders I could spend some time climbing on top of that I was never aware of, and all of a sudden I felt like where previously felt I'd peaked, I felt like, oh man, I'm not even halfway up the mountain, and it was kind of an elation, like an incredible feeling to be like, I've got somewhere to go, I've got something to still do. And since then, I definitely feel that I am a permanent, and we'll get into this later, permanent student of the form, the craft of it. Like it's kind of a higher power than I am, the art of it, and I sort of chase it. So these days, what the sort of most recent development is the shows I make are somewhere between. I appreciate this is a much longer answer than you probably expected, but this is the point. It's difficult to describe what I do. The shows I create now are somewhere in between a one-person play or maybe storytelling show, you could say. Um, uh, and they incorporate magic in the same way that if you go and see like a West End theatre play, they've got like special effects, right? Like if you go and see the Harry Potter plays in London or something, incredible visual effects to make these, wizards come to life on stage, so to speak. But all of that magic is visual. It's like, kind of classic stage illusion. It occurred to me, well, if you can integrate the magic in a live performance in the way they do, could you do that with magic that is the kind that I grew up on? So I grew up watching like Darren Brown and stuff. He dropped his first special in 2000. I was about 12, which was obviously massively influential in the world of magic, let alone on me. So I was really into mentalism, the kind of mind ready magic. Um, and also just like other kinds of stage magic that required audience participation. And it was like, okay, well, can I deliver a narrative that's a fictional narrative, but without a fourth wall, so I'm directly addressing the audience in a way that allows me to perform magic that is part of the narrative and integrated into the narrative, not in an analogous sense. So it's not like I'm doing a magic trick and it's representative of something. I want the magic to feel like it's happening in the moment, or it's demonstrative, or it's experimentative. In the same way that, like, if Harry Potter on stage waves his wand, magic happens. That's happening in the action of the play. Like, that is in world. That's what I wanted to do with the kind of magic that you would see a magician perform, um, and uh, and that's what I'm doing at the moment. And I'm also a big fan of writing. So the shows are like the new ones, like a murder mystery thing, which is my floor right now. I almost want to turn over the camera. I'm not going to. Is full of bits of paper, all like with little scenes written out on it, and like it's a bloody complicated story, but it's going okay. So there you go. That's kind of what I do. I make a theatrical magic performances. Let's call them that for now.
That's so interesting, man. Okay, so I guess we kind of got this sort of like this sort of way that you're performing, and you found your niche and your speciality within this space. I guess would it be possible for us to drill down a little bit further, go a little bit more to roots, to base, and trying to understand kind of what the essence of a magic performance is like? What is it that kind of makes a magical experience kind of truly captivating?
That's a great question. So, am I allowed to swear, or is it better if I don't?
You are. Go for it.
Okay, cool. So, I do think there's a culture of shitting on other magicians, right? And the older I get, and I'm not that old, but like the older I get, and the more that I feel accomplished in the world that I'm working in, the more I can understand it. Because like you know, with any art form, the vast majority of people who practice that art will be amateurs or hobbyists, and that's great, and some of the greatest magicians in the world are amateurs and hobbyists. And then a lot, as I said, sort of 95% of the professional magicians or something will be doing weddings and things like that and corporate events and stuff. And that makes sense. It's only in the last few years that I've realized, and I didn't come to these conclusions. They're ideas that have been shared with me by colleagues and, like-minded people, that magic at a certain point started following stand-up comedy more than it did theater, because that was a very commercial output. And in terms of like weddings and corporate events, the idea of close-up magic, again, is a very practical commercial output, right? And so I think magic, much like every art form, has been, significantly affected by capitalism and the way in which the most practical ways to make money doing it, which is fair enough, right? Like that is what it is. But I do think that that fundamentally affects the nature of what the art form is, because if I show you a card trick, right, and I'm at your wedding, or you're at a wedding that I've been hired to be at, right? There's only so much, despite my best effort, that is possible. I don't want to limit it and say that this is impossible. Of course not. And truth be told, I'm actually starting from after January to experiment with this exact point. But there's only so much that you can really expect someone to, I don't want to say believe, but like expect someone to invest within that specific context, right? Whereas if we go back like, however many hundreds of years, to sort of tribal humans, and the idea of a magician, an actor, a priest, a doctor, like all of those roles would have been encompassed within one person, right? And they would have given performances, or another word might be to say rituals, you know, um, that were, I don't know, they might have a magical, like they might make the rain come, or they might just like G you up before battle, or they might be funeral rites or whatever, like all of these rituals. And I'm interested a lot in ritual, like as a point. And that, we call it magic. Traditionally has always been a pejorative word. Like the heathens do magic, we're the good guys, we're the priests, we have religion, they have magic. But I because I've been a magician my whole life, I feel like magic's a bit more of a like I like the word, so I use it a lot. I find some religious people get a bit upset when I not upset, like not I'm trying to offend them, but like prayer is magic, isn't it? Like of course it is. But I suppose what I mean is like the magic that they would have performed, right? And you might think to yourself like, oh, ritual magic, but like ventriloquism was like back in the day. You'd have an effigy, and the effigy would speak because it has been imbued by the spirit of a demon, and it was ventriloquism. Like the person doing the rituals, ventriloquist. Um, and if you said to that person, "Hey, but you're tricking your audience," you know what I mean? Like you're doing a conscious deception in order to give them a certain belief. I'm confident that, and I can't prove this, but I'm pretty sure. And to be fair, I do think this is true. I think there's record of this. They wouldn't understand what you meant. They'd be like, "What do you mean I'm tricking them? I'm doing the ritual as I was taught, and they are experiencing the ritual. And we both have different experiences of the same moment, but the ritual is as valid for both parties, and we both believe in it, you know?" And that's obviously, a bit of a can of worms, but like, it's a very interesting point. It's more akin to like a musician who's singing a song, and like at the end of the day, the words have been carefully crafted and they rhyme, and like there's a musical underscore, and they've probably performed it 1,000 times, but every single time they perform it, it needs to be authentic and true, and like they need to live in the moment. Magicians can do the same, in my opinion. You can perform magic and make that authentic. And I think a part of making that authentic is you as the magician believing in like what you're doing, which is, obviously a complicated point, because it's like, do I believe that the magic's happening for real, or do I not allow myself to believe that? Regardless, the angle is that you're giving an authentic like performance, right? Like there's a sense of belief within you. I think when you're performing on stage, it can be a bit easier to access that. When you're performing for a very small amount of people, it can be easier to access that. If you're like, say, a tarot reader, and there's obvious, like, really interesting overlaps between things like tarot reading, spiritualism, um, like palm reading, a lot of those kind of esoteric phenomena, esoteric practice that require some kind of, I was about to use the word performer, but like practitioner, let's say, because I'll do my show, and there's a bit in one of my shows where like something falls over, and before it falls over, I kind of encourage the audience to try and make it fall over with their mind. And I still get, and I'm remembering one specific interaction actually, where a person came up to me after the show, and was wholly convinced, or rather not convinced, but I mean, they were convinced, but they were sort of saying to me, "Was that meant to happen?" Because when it fell, this is the person talking to me. When it fell, it was the exact moment where I thought fall, and there had been a delay, like it hadn't fallen. And then I'd moved on and then it fell, which is, theatrically, I do that intentionally because it's interesting. But as it happened, this person in the audience at that exact moment must have looked at the block of wood and thought fall, and it did. Now, in one sense, you could say, oh, like, you know, obviously it wasn't them. Obviously it's not psychic powers, science, which I'm on board with. But then in another sense, like, I would never want that person to leave thinking that they had, magic powers exactly, or that like the laws of physics could be broken. But they had a moment, you know, and that moment was because I was doing something authentic. And I feel like, I don't know. So it's an almost impossible question to answer. Is the truth of it. Like, the experience of magic is incredibly varied and will go from a puzzle that you cannot decipher to a transcendent experience of feeling connected with the world and maybe even being able to alter reality. So yeah, man, it's a big one.
Yeah, it's huge. There are obviously so many directions we can now take this in, which is great.
It's
Um,
like a choose your own adventure.
yeah, page 4 or page 2? Where should we go next? Um, I guess it'd be interesting. I mean, you sometimes hear individuals speak of rituals across the board here, not just regarding kind of magical rituals, but any sort of ritual as a way of almost kind of creating or channeling energy. Now, you can kind of take that as a sort of kind of psychological sense where somebody's directing something so something happens, which I would kind of attribute happens quite a lot. I can even think of those sorts of situations at work where we're channeling the company that I work for to have a certain perspective or viewpoint, and we're kind of focusing psychological direction. But then others kind of view it as a sort of actual sort of physical presence or energy that gets kind of controlled or channeled as a ritual is taking place. And I guess there is a sort of line between the two of these, but very often it can become quite blurry in something like a sort of kind of performance where you're on stage and there's individuals in the audience who are captivated and kind of participating in that. So I wonder, could you kind of explore that space for us? Kind of how does this sort of like, I guess, the sort of manifestation of, I guess, magic activities taking place kind of transpire for you as the presenter?
Mm. Yeah, it's an interesting thought, a question. Well, thought. I think, I think it's it's a complicated one for ethical reasons as much as anything else. Because what I, and again, the stuff I'm talking about here, I want to make it clear, I don't necessarily represent magicians by what I'm saying. These are the conclusions that I've came to through my own work, right? And I just want to, I'm not speaking for the community, just in case they would disagree, Um, but I think the safest and sort of healthiest and most authentic best way to do the performance element and like from like as in like what my anchor is to the thing is to realize that I am the I've struggled to come up with a good word for it that again doesn't sound too because like I used to do a show that was like the Cult of Dave where I try to get people to join my cult, which was just this comedy idea I had ages and ages ago, but played into the strength of my sort of angle I was taking, the funny bit. But as that's developed in a funny way, I've come full circle because I look at it now and I don't want people to join my cult or anything, but like it was called the Cult of Dave because it was all about me, right? It's like, hey, join me, like I'm the charismatic leader, which is a big problem because power is it's intoxicating, isn't it? And that's what happens. But like the true spiritual, religious, whatever you want to say, like path, I would argue, is that of the monk, right? Who's a kind of quiet like follower of their own thing, and I think that's probably what I want to like that's the angle that I want to take. I want to kind of show the audience and show, I choose that word intentionally, like not as a pun, but I want to like show them or illustrate to them or like kind of like I'm opening a little door for them into a world that I think like look at this divine, look at this thing that is divine, right? And it's got nothing to do with me. I'm literally just pointing in the direction that you should be looking. And the divine and your experience with the divine of the art is that I'm only involved as the tour guide, and even then I don't want to like, the less I do to sully the path that you have between yourself and the divine of that, the better, right? So it's kind of like priest is even the word priest, like all of these words now tend to have negative connotations because they all tend to be associated with abuses of power, right? Which is kind of funny. Whereas monk doesn't, which is why I've gone over to that. So I think, like, from my perspective, when I'm on stage and when I'm performing, of course, it's incredibly intoxicating. Like, incredibly intoxicating. It's like awesome. I mean, first off, from a practical expense, I'm like, and I think most performers are, there's this story that Dustin Hoffman tells about Laurence Olivier where they were doing Marathon Man and they apparently had dinner afterwards. And Dustin Hoffman said to Olivier, who's widely considered the greatest actor who ever lived, "Why'd you do it?" And then Olivier apparently leaned over the table and got this close to Dustin Hoffman's face and went, "Look at me, look at me, look at me, look at me, look at me," which I totally get. Like standing on stage, just everyone look at me. Hey, and that is an important part of why I do what I do, and I'd be a fool to not acknowledge that. But what's so important is over time trying to not bury that, but like just accept it, allow that feeling to be like, hey, I'm enjoying being the center of attention. That's great. But my job, or rather my like vocation, my destiny, whatever, it's not about me. It's about this incredible thing that is the art, and it's about facilitating that to the people. You know, I think that's probably a good way to go. Like I'm really fascinated with like there's these cave paintings that are like 40,000 years old, handprints on the side of caves, and like clearly they're made by like dozens and dozens of people, and people think that it was like a ritual to create like a better hunt, like positive hunting rituals or something like that. But I look at that and I'm like, there's not a single person who would say that isn't a work of art, and it was created by the process of ritual by a load of people. But there still had to be one person who was the first guy who put their hand or her hand on the wall and leave the print, and then sort of suggest to everyone Why don't you do it? You know, and like just because that person was the first, or was the person who pointed and said that wall over there, they're important only in the sense that they're needed. You know, they're a requirement, but it's about everyone else. You know, and it's about their touching the wall. Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
How's that? How's that for an answer?
If you want more ways to engage with the show, join our locals community. Membership is free and gives you access to all my updates, the reading plan, and early access to all audio-only versions of each episode. Supporters can ask guest questions, comment on posts, and get early access to all video versions of each episode. Your support is essential for the show's growth. The best way to support the show is through our locals community. You can also contribute via YouTube Super Thanks, PayPal, Substack, and even Bitcoin. All links are in the description. And thank you for helping us to continue to create content. That was good, yeah. I mean, I think, we kind of can trace ritual really far back into human history. I mean, there are kind of a couple of Neanderthal burial sites which have items that have been buried with those who have passed away. And
Yeah,
obviously we can't say that, they obviously definitely believed in a god or whatever, but obviously there was some sort of ritual that was taking place where they wanted to imbue what was going on when that individual passed away with some meaning of some sort. Now
hundred
you
percent.
can kind of guess what that means, but ritual has an interesting sort of way of kind of beginning to propagate and go forwards. And you were kind of also talking then about kind of, that individual leaning forward saying, look at my face, look at my face, look at my face. It's really interesting because you can kind of watch various sort of kind of acts that are being delivered. And I kind of watched your TEDx presentation a couple of days ago in preparation for this show. I'd watched it a while ago, but thought I'd rewatch it. And there's sort of the lighting, the chair. It's almost like you instantly lean forward, you lean into it, and you want to get engaged. And there's just such a fascinating dichotomy here between the performer and the audience. And I guess I want to ask a question on that. I mean, you might not like either of these two words, like illusion or deception, but I think it would be interesting to kind of understand like how you kind of balance the art of this sort of kind of deception. Should we go with? Feel free to change the word if you want. So this sort of balancing of deception with the responsibility of also keeping your audiences entertained, but also grounded. There seems to be like a tricky element there. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but what are your thoughts in that space?
No, you're definitely right. It's a huge, and I've talked to magicians about this a lot. Like, I've got a really good mate called Ben who runs a bar in Liverpool that he built himself. I used to know him back in the days when I was doing close-up magic, and so was he. He was doing like the clubs, I did the restaurants. Um, and he's built this bar, and he's a brilliant magician, and he's and I like him a lot. And we had this really interesting conversation because there's an effect that you can do where you can essentially, and I'm not going to get into method here because what's the point? But like you can have someone think of a name of someone they know, and then through magical means, you as the performer know what the name is they're thinking of, and you can reveal that you know that by saying the name or whatever, and that's powerful. Now, I could do that, and it could feel like a puzzle, you know, or you could dress it up enough that it feels like, I don't know, let's say like facial tick reading or like subtle body movements or stuff like that, which is akin to what Darren Brown does, right? Now, the method is sleight of hand, straight up. Same as how I do a card trick. The method is sleight of hand. And I appreciate that's, sometimes a bit difficult for people to get their head around, but just absolutely trust me on it, right? Like, the method is sleight of hand. It's the exact same as if I was doing a card trick, right? It's the same idea. It does not require psychological ability, right? But Darren implies that a lot of what he does is psychological ability, right? Like subtle suggestion. Now, he's never explicitly stated this, right? And he's always said that he uses magic, but he's smart enough to know that show don't tell, right? Like everything he does gives the impression of those abilities, right? And like his TV show, when it first came out on 4OD back in the days before streaming was a thing, and when Channel 4 got on the game really early with that, his TV show was listed in the science section of Channel 4's website, which Simon Singh wrote a letter to the Times, I want to say, saying, no, it's not. It's entertainment. He's not doing any kind of science. And it was moved, you know? But it immediately speaks to the perception of the effect. This guy isn't a guy doing card tricks. This is a guy doing a skill, like a skill that, you know, requires some kind of reading or whatever, and it doesn't. Is that ethical? I don't know. He is the most famous magician in this country, and arguably the greatest living magician. You go to another side of the extreme, you get someone like Uri Geller, who bends spoons. Again, sleight of hand. But he always said it was real, right? Now, I've spoken to people who were in a like he came to, like, I want to say Cambridge or something, and did a demonstration in the Cambridge University, you know, in the big room in Cambridge University where they have these speakers. And someone described to me what he did, and it was, when they described what he did, I was like, that's magical. Like I'll say it, actually, it doesn't matter, does it? It's only Uri Geller. He made a seed, like a seed of a plant, in his hand sprout and grow in front of everyone, and there was a camera on it. And I was like, that's insane. And when that was described to me, I was like, that sounds unbelievable. And then I found a video of him doing it, and the video of him doing it looked absolutely nothing, not even slightly a shadow of what was described. And this is a fundamental element of magic. Magicians use this all the time, like false memory. You will perceive, like, the farther away, and this is, you know, it's why witness testimony is like mental, right? Like, it doesn't really work. Like, you're only remembering your perception of the event, right? And that gets muddied down. Magicians know that and can do a trick that is in the moment so simple, but can leave you with enough that when you retell the story later, it becomes gargantuan. Now, with Yuri, he wanted you to believe that he could do it. And that speaks to the gargantuan tale you tell afterwards, right? Because you're not saying, I watched a magician do a trick. It's like, I watched that guy, Yuri Geller, who, as we all know, can do impossible things, do something impossible, right? Nothing to do with magician, nothing to do with magic, nothing to do with sleight of hand, right? That's an ethically complicated thing. Now, back to my mate Ben. He sometimes, when he gets someone to think of a name, might get someone to think of, sometimes, actually, no, better way to say this, sometimes people think of a name of someone who's died, right? Now, they just do that of their own accord, which means when Ben reveals the name to them, and he does it in a beautiful way, it hits harder emotionally, and people will often cry, you know? Now, you could call that emotional manipulation, especially because I think but also you could call that, you could call that emotional manipulation, or you could call that a beautifully executed piece of magic, right? What's incredibly ethically complicated is Ben, genius that he is, has come up with methods to encourage a person to think of the name of someone who has died without expressly telling them that that's the case. Which sounds, again, I can't really get into method, but linguistic tricks in the way you ask the question to subtly suggest to someone, and this does sound a bit psychological, and to be honest, this kind of is. It's not guaranteed, it won't work every time, but you can definitely put a person in a position where they are more likely to think of a name that is passed on without expressly telling them to do that, which is, you know, a bit more comfortable. Because if you say to someone, I want you to think of the name of someone who's died, if they're not in the mood for that kind of thing, oh my god, that's a horrible thing to ask someone to do. Or, you know, a potentially very, very risky thing for someone to do. And I've done stuff like that, and it can backfire, you know. But if that person of their own accord thinks of someone who's died, and they understand the nature of what they're seeing, and Ben doesn't open with that, this is something toward the end of his, like, 20-minute set, and they've already seen him do mind-reading type stuff, they're thinking of that name knowing that something is going to happen, right? And when he reveals it, I guarantee that for a moment they feel close to that person again in a way they haven't felt close to that person in forever. Now, if they knew that the method he was using was simple sleight of hand, that would totally sully the bit. But I'm confident that a lot of those people, especially in Ben's case, do not believe that he has Uri Geller style supernatural powers. They understand that he is an illusionist of a sort. I do think that most people have an innate sense of what is fair play and what isn't, even with magicians. Magicians, as a rule, anything is fair play, right? Like, especially the good ones. Like, most things are fair play. And what I mean by that is, you could, if I said to you, all right, I've got an audience of people, and I point to a guy in the front row, and I say, stand up, and he stands up, and I say, your grandfather's name is John. And he says, yes. And it's just as clean as that. I walk out, I point to a guy, he stands up, and he does it. Now, if that guy is a stooge, i.e., an actor who I have paid to just say yes, that's not fair play. That is to say, if the audience found that out or suspected that, they would not like anything else I did. For some reason, that feels like cheating, okay? If he stood up and I psychologically, by watching his body language, facial clues, whatever, worked out that his granddad's name was John, that is allowed for some reason. People go, oh yeah, that's a demonstration of skill, right? Even though I can't do that, but I could give the impression I could. If I, on the other hand, had him maybe write down the name and I somehow looked at him writing it down, but no one saw me look at it, right? Which is a very common way of doing that kind of effect. That's much more of a grey area. In one sense, they might go, oh, well, it's sleight of hand. But I could do that, have him write something down, secretly look at it in some way, and then, through the act of revealing it, imply that I'm using some kind of psychological trick against Darren Brown. I wish I could give you the answer and say, here's the ethical approach, here's the non-ethical approach. But at the end of the day, every performer, magician or non-magician, fundamentally, if you stand in a corner or you stand on a platform 6 inches higher than anyone else is standing, you have power. And with power comes responsibility. It's the reason, like, right now, everyone's sort of, diving on top of comedians when they make a joke that they think is offensive. And it's like, well, I understand why that's a problem, because the thing is, as much as comedians want to say it's only a joke, you're standing on stage with a microphone and a camera, usually, right? And that's a lot of people are going to see that. And most people, there are a lot of people who genuinely believe that comedians just make up the jokes as they go along on the day. They don't think this is a part of a well-constructed, very well-written and well-acted monologue that has been prepared ahead of time. They also don't understand that the character they're watching on stage might not be a solid representation of the actual character of the performer. Classic example in this country is Al Murray, the pub landlord, who is a very liberal, left-wing, guy who stands on stage and plays a character of a right-wing publican. And it's funny because he is parodying a character. But it's been going for so long that there is absolutely no question, and I'm aware that he knows this, I believe that he knows this, I don't know the guy personally, that some of his audience don't see it as a parody. People see it as good old-fashioned British comedy, which, is a bit more of an ethical grey area. It's like, okay, well, if suddenly now no one is in on the joke, is he just now espouting views that he himself doesn't believe in and are maybe stirring up a political sentiment that he does not support? Is that an ethical position to be in? It's a bloody complicated one, So I think there's no solid answer. The best thing you could possibly do is hope that the performer is, I don't know, has their own kind of moral ethics. It's the reason that we, we have very strict laws regarding therapists or doctors. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, an artist often is a therapist for people in a way. I don't think that's a weird thing to say. I'm not saying I therapize my audience, but how many people are sad and listen to certain songs or whatever, like art is like, it's powerful for that and it's dangerous. And an artist has great power. And I don't know if you've ever heard about this guy called Spider-Man, but he once said something very clever about power.
He did indeed. He did indeed. That was Uncle Ben, right? I think. Um,
That's
this is
true.
so fascinating.
I hate that you got that right, But, like
I'm
Spider-Man
such a
definitely
geek.
said it himself a couple of times. A
Yeah,
couple
in,
of
in his
times.
in his head, he just reminded himself of what Uncle Ben said as he was passing away
Exactly,
in front of him.
exactly, exactly. And I
Um,
feel like if I'd have said Uncle Ben in that moment, it wouldn't have landed the way it did. But at the same
no,
time, I can't disagree with you, mate. You're right. Uncle Ben said it. Spider-Man didn't.
so in that case, I think it'd be interesting to kind of begin to look at the idea of sort of ritual and routine for yourself. Like, what's it like? You're obviously going to go onto a stage and you're going to kind of perform something that you've planned well ahead of time. Is there a sort of ritual or routine that you prepare yourself through to then perform another ritual and routine on the stage?
That's a good question. Learning your lines is a difficult thing to do, and is so vital, and is like one of those things where there's a really good video of Peter O'Toole, another brilliant actor, talking about sort of getting aggressive with an interviewer when the interviewer said, aside from just learning your lines, and Peter O'Toole was like, do you know how, like, learning your lines is so, how many things do you know by heart? And it's true, like, the vast majority of people maybe know a poem by heart, maybe, and mostly they don't, right? Like, maybe you know your phone number and stuff, but when it comes to, like, big swaths of dialogue, it's bloody hard to do. And the only way it can be achieved is through constant repetition before the event. And it's such a vital part of the process, especially when you're doing something dialogue heavy, because you simply cannot start to act. An act, to be clear, is not about like pretending exactly. I mean, obviously it is, but like a better word to use to those who don't do it themselves is to say, like, like recital or like an authentic, you know, right now when we're talking, I'm not planning the words I'm saying. I'm just saying them almost as simultaneously as to the thought. Same for you, right? Same to every other human being, right? But if I started just going into a like a monologue or something, if at any point during my speaking of that, I have to think, what's the next word? It's broken. Like the ritual, you could even say, the magic's broken, because then I stop being authentic and I start doing a thing that humans don't do, which is try and self-edit, right? Or like you know what I mean? Like mostly like try and remember the words that we're going to say. So you need to absolutely be able to breathe the dialogue you're going to speak, and it takes so long, and it's really important, and it can so easily be overlooked as a thing. But apart from that, like just on a silly sort of note, I've got like a few things. I'll shake my hands before I go on stage sometimes, but these days not so much. Like I think for me, a big part of what I do now is in the creation of the work that happens off stage. On stage is incredibly valuable, of course it is, but the preparation before I go on stage, so the writing, which is, I'm deep. I'm very. I love systems. I love mechanical, like craft things. So like the craft of writing. Right now, like I say, I'm doing a murder mystery, which is so, you know, like it's very, because you want it to be fair play. You want it to feel like an old Agatha Christie. So when they see the murder happen, or rather, like just before the end, they could potentially work it out themselves because they've got all of the clues, which means a massive amount of mechanical writing, like to be able to seed the clues hidden well enough, not so complex it would be impossible to work out even if you tried, but complex enough that you couldn't work it out in the moment. You know what I mean? Excuse me. I do apologize. Um, but yeah, in terms of like ritual, I'd say that's the best. I don't think there's anything else apart from learning lines and sort of ensuring the material is solid before you go on stage. I've been doing it
Mm.
so long now that, like I say, I'm very comfortable on stage. So mostly, the moment I'm out there, it just feels like I'm having a conversation with some friends or telling a story or exactly like this. You know what I mean? Like I don't have a lot of anxiety about it. So yeah, I think rituals mainly exist to make you feel comfortable in some way or in control. And so because I'm very comfortable and in control of what I do, mostly, I don't necessarily need a lot of ritual prior to getting out there, you know?
I've often heard it said as well that, obviously you're going to be kind of performing at times. There'll be some sort of drunk twat in the crowd. He'll just shout like a random word and potentially kind of throw you off, and then that will kind of simmer down. Like, do you have any sort of like touch points or phrases in your head which will then bring you back into line so that the kind of script then begins to flow again? Like, does that happen much to you?
It's a good question. So like historically, obviously, I've had loads of hecklers, like any performer has when you've been doing it, as long as I have, or as long as you have. Especially if you're doing like stand-up comedy and stuff. Mostly not. Like these days, because I tend to do public shows that are people are buying tickets to come and see me. It's very, very, very rare, if pretty much not at all. I don't think I've ever had this happen actually. Really, if they're buying a ticket to come and see me, that they're going to be a dick because they've paid, right? Like they've already made a significant investment to have an evening. And they know the whole audience is on my side. Whereas if I, I'm at the Edinburgh Fringe, I'm doing like a late night cabaret spot, it's not my show, I'm just doing 5 or 10 minutes in the show, and maybe it's a bit of a rowdy night, then stuff can happen. And the way you handle that is the moment you get on stage, you dominate the room as quickly as you possibly can. I say dominate the room. I mean, because I'm not very tall, I've got red hair, I've got glasses, there's a lot of obvious things that you could attack me for visually. I ensure that when I get on stage, I don't want to say you're afraid to do that, but the reason I think people would do that is because they don't trust me to entertain them. They don't trust me to be in control of the situation. So and I think this is where, a lot of the sort of big confidence as a performer had to come from, is that when I get on stage, I'm very used to very, very, very quickly making it clear to the audience, hey, don't worry, I'm good at this, which sounds kind of silly, but I think it's so vital. And I think it's like an element of the craft that's often underused, and you've got to come on with this strength and this energy. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, but in terms of I don't like Heckler put down lines. I've never really been that guy. I've got funny lines, funny lines, but and they're just classic. If anything, I try to not use anything anymore. I definitely don't use lines in my actual scripted shows. I'm talking about comedy magic now, just because that's a place where that kind of thing will happen. But if someone drops a glass or something, just casually saying, "Oh, I did that with my mind." Just saying that very quickly, immediately after the noise. And that's a reflex now, just because it'll get a laugh, and it always does, which is a bit silly, but it's fun. It's a fun little bit of, business, so to speak. So I've got, little moments like that, but it's very rare that I get anyone who's particularly aggressive as a heckler or something, or drunk. And if it's too bad, you get someone to get rid of them. Or there's once or twice I have, gotten people to leave the room, which is, uncomfortable, and you don't want to have to do it. But I'm comfortable enough with conflict now, and I trust myself enough as a performer to understand that and it's very, very, very rare this happens. I can only really think of one instance I know this has happened. It's probably happened more than once, but there's one particular instance I'm thinking of where some people, 3 or 4 people who were in the room, clearly just, I don't know why they were there, but I don't know if they didn't want to be there. They were just chatting some shit. And I told them to shut up, essentially, in no uncertain terms, but within the character, early on. And they didn't. And then I just said, hey, come on, let's get you out. Now, that's awkward for everyone involved, right? They left, for sure. They didn't argue with me. They left. But it's awkward for the audience. And that moment in time, I've then got to... The moment I get back on stage, I need to... It's not about pretending it never happened. It's about... But it's also not about dwelling on it or acknowledging it too much, because, how do you acknowledge that? What do you say to the audience that they don't already know? Everyone knows what that situation was. You don't need to make a joke about it. You just go back into the world. And I think as it happened in that particular example, it was one of my scripted shows. I was performing at a festival, though. It wasn't anyway. But the good thing about the scripted show is I've got the script. So the moment that happens, the way to get back into it is, in fact, in the TED Talk, same thing. The TED Talk was a lot of dialogue, and I didn't give myself enough time to memorize it. And I delivered it, and there's a bit cut out of the talk where essentially I said something, and I didn't expect it was going to get a laugh. A mate of mine warned me. I read it out to him beforehand. He was like, hey, David, just so you know, that bit's funny, and you're going to get a laugh. And I was like, yeah, whatever. But then in the show, there's about 1,100 people in the room, which is probably the biggest audience I've ever played in front of. In fact, definitely is. The laugh was so big, or the room is built, because it was in the stage in Gateshead. So like the room, it's a music venue, really. It's built for acoustics. So the laugh hit me like this wall, and I'd never experienced that before. Like that scale of the noise, and it threw me. Like my brain I didn't expect it, and I couldn't remember my next line, and I don't want to say I froze. I didn't freeze. What I did was I just went quiet because I was trying to remember the line. And I was comfortable. I was nervous, but I was nervous because I knew I only had one take. But I'm not daft. Like I knew that it was being filmed, and all I had to do was ensure that I stayed silent until I remembered the words, and then they'd cut it out. And I stayed silent because I was trying to remember the line. And then I realized it had been long enough that I needed to acknowledge it. So I said something. I can't remember what I said. Something like, "Don't worry, I've got this," to the audience. And that gets a laugh as well, because, it's kind of funny saying, "Don't worry, I've got this." Everyone kind of realizes. And then once I remembered it, I just calmly went back into it. And that's what it, like to the other point, like the script is the savior. Like the moment you can lose yourself in the words again, that's like, it's kind of like it takes you along like a river, like a ritual, you might even say.
That's so funny. It's so interesting. I guess as well, you kind of talk about putting the audience at ease. I guess the audience could come to your show. They could be kind of, desiring to see this sort of performance take place. They could be desiring to kind of have this, but I can imagine people being brought with their partners or friends or whoever, and they're a little bit kind of resistant or reluctant to be involved and kind of skeptical of the whole thing. Just, oh, another fucking performance, great, or whatever it is. Kind of do you kind of see the kind of different individuals? Obviously, you'll see different individuals come to your performance wanting different things, but do people tend to walk away having all come to the same place eventually? Like how do you kind of view the sort of the kind of classic skeptic kind of getting on board with the journey and then being led along as you're going through your sort of dialogue?
Sure. I think I think about Star Wars. I think about 1977. They released the movie Star Wars, and no one had seen anything like that. And if someone said to you before you went into that movie, "Hey, this is going to be the best movie you've ever seen," you've totally fucked it for them, right? Because that's like that class. Like you have now, it won't work anymore. You've killed the magic. But if you go in blind with very little expectation, maybe just a rough idea of what it is, it's such an incredibly well told, classic mechanical hero's journey story that ticks it triggers every element in the brain of like satisfaction. You're gonna get a 99% hit rate on conversion when you leave, right? Everyone is like, "Mate, I like Star Wars." Or at the very least, I don't hate Star Wars. I enjoyed it. Maybe I'm not like a hardcore fan. And obviously, Star Wars means something kind of different now. But I'm thinking 1977, that moment, right, when someone told this epic story that was fantastical in every sense. The way I deal with anyone, we think of, it's funny because we think of skeptic, and like, you don't think of skeptic when you say movie, right? Like, you wouldn't think, oh, skeptical about him. Like, maybe a bit, but like with magic, it's a common phrase. And it's because, the only reason you'd be skeptical if I'm trying to peddle something that's not true, right? Like, if I'm trying to imply that, hey, I'm doing X, but actually I'm doing Y and I'm getting one over on you. And I understand why magic feels like that. But the reason I think magic feels like that, and the reason that people associate the word skeptic with magic, is because of magicians really mostly performing in a sense that, hey, I'm clever because I can do something and you're not very clever. Like, even like common parlance within magic is, I will fool you, which is, like a shitty thing to do. Like, no one really wants to be fooled. People want to be, taken on a journey, like, really. An actor who's, they're not fooling anyone, are they? It's like, oh, I'm pretending to be someone else. Yeah, we get it though. Like, we're all invested. We're all doing the suspension of disbelief thing. We're all on the journey. So I think for me, as long as I'm authentic, and as long as when I come on stage, everyone immediately goes, "Oh, I get what this is." I understand the context of what you are doing. Like, it doesn't feel like because if you're confused, then you're buggered, right? Like, it's kind of back to the Uri Geller thing, right? Like, if Uri Geller's bending the spoon, you might sit there and think, "Wow, this guy has magical powers." You might sit there going, "This guy's trying to trick me into thinking he's got magical powers." Or you might sit there going, "I don't understand what I'm watching right now. Like, I know that he can't be bending the spoon because that breaks like science, and I believe in science, but it looks like he believes it, and some people who are sitting next to me kind of believe that that's what he's doing, but I know that's not what's happening. I feel like what's happening, and it's just confusion. All of those things are bad, right? Whereas, like, if a guy comes out on stage and just sits down and starts telling you a story, or even, like, let's keep it to magic. If a guy comes out and starts doing a card trick, pretty much everyone there, I'm not saying that's artistically better by any stretch, but like at the very least, everyone in the room goes, "Oh, I'm about to be shown some sleight of hand." Like that's pretty much what everyone thinks at that point. They're like, "Oh, it's sleight of hand." Right? And sleight of hand falls into the fair play category of magic, right? So again, like, you might get some unusual skeptics or skeptics isn't a word, insecure people is a better way to frame it, who, regardless of the way it's being presented, feel like they are being attacked. That's an issue with them. That's nothing to do with me. Those people are incredibly rare, but they do exist. But I think those people would also react to, oh, you've got a black Spider-Man? That's not right. Like, Spider-Man's white in the comics, right? Like it's the same kind of thing. Like, that's about you, mate. That's not about the storytelling. That is about your, like, perception of the world. Your, like, version of reality, your own personal insecurities of why you feel that way. That's got nothing to do with the art itself. So as long as the art does its job and brings you in on the story in such a way that everyone goes, I'm with you. I get this. I get what we're doing, And even if I end up by not liking it and I didn't enjoy it, like a good example of that actually is my wife sometimes watches like reality TV. Never been a big fan of reality TV. And there was one I watched with her called Below Deck, and I got sucked into it. And I don't like it in the sense that I don't really like a lot of reality TV. Like, I don't want to say like morally, that's a bit like high horse, but like, it's a bit weird, isn't it? Like, I do think there's a lot of ethical questions with like reality TV, but I appreciated the craft. Like, because I'm watching it and I was so like, oh man, like, I've been absolutely dragged into this show, like sucked in the editing, like, and it's wearing, it's like, this is not lying to me about what it is. Like, I get what this show is. You know what I mean? I mean, in one sense, it's lying to me because it's not like really showing me reality. Yeah, yeah, maybe that's a bit of a complicated one. I mean, for me, I knew what was going on. And I think most people who watch that kind of stuff do. They go, well, this is trashy TV, isn't it? And it's like, even if you don't like it, you can still go, well, you're playing an authentic game. Like, you're doing what you say on the tin. And how can you be a skeptic about that? Yeah.
If you're looking for more ways to enjoy our content, check out the YouTube channel for full-length videos or explore our Rumble channel for an alternative video platform. You can also listen to the podcast in your favourite feed, and while you're there, please leave a positive and written review. It helps others to find the show. Lastly, you can read all my essays over on Substack, and by signing up, each new instalment will be delivered straight to your inbox. All links are in the description, and thank you for following along. Yeah, it's interesting. I guess the next thing I want to kind of focus on is, I guess, trying to understand where the boundary between perception and reality kind of truly lies. I can imagine for most people they'll be like, well, obviously I know where that boundary lies, but I feel like for you, David, and the work that you're involved with, it must have made you question and kind of explore and almost muddy that boundary at times. Would you mind kind of helping us understand kind of the idea of kind of what's real, or where these boundaries between the perception and the reality of the world that we inhabit actually sit?
Sure. Yeah, because easy question. No, I imagine I can only speak for myself, as I've already made clear in everything I've said. Like, I personally fit into the camp of, I don't really feel like there's an objective reality, right? And I'm not going to be as keyed up as to general philosophy as you are. So please do feel free to correct me here, or put me in the in the direction of certain philosophies that uh, yeah, I know a bit of it, obviously, but you know what I mean. So, like, I don't necessarily. I've always thought, well, there's no objective reality. Everything that I experience is my own version of events, right? I mean, case in point, false memory. That like feels as real as anything, and yet you watch a video of the moment, you're like, oh shit, none of that happened. Actually, so it's like, well, okay, so reality is essentially like just like all subjective. That being said, how do you explain science? Because that feels objective, doesn't it? It feels really objective. And I'd say, well, I reckon a better way to frame that might be like pragmatic subjectivism. You know what I mean? Like everyone agrees, oh well, this kind of works, doesn't it? Like this seems to fit within some fundamental law that seems to be true all the time, and it's working for us. 10 out of 10. Now the fact is, things that we absolutely believe to be facts change all the time, all the time, and we're always convinced of one thing, and then later we find it's something else. Now that isn't a bad thing. That's a really good thing, and that, if anything, speaks to the brilliance of science, right? Like, and how more and more scientists are the ones, and doctors are a good example of this, who are never certain of anything. They say, yeah, probably, should be, maybe is this, because they're smart enough to know that they don't know everything. Um, Makes perfect sense. So, given that, when it comes to like hard like concrete practical things like medicine or science or anything like that, like like engineering, physics, all of that stuff, like the pragmatic subjectivism stuff, it works, and to deny that seems very mad to me. Like it seems like I mean, case in point, people who deny that on like a big scale, we tend to think of them as kind of like mad a bit, like a different version of reality. And the extreme end would be something like paranoid schizophrenic or something, someone who like really does, we say they lose their grip on reality, or at the very least their perception of reality, their subjective reality is vastly different to everyone else's, usually to their severe detriment, and often to the detriment of everyone around them, right? So that's not like, that's terrific. When it comes to questions of art or religion, which are always things that deal with, big unknowns that science hasn't really been able to help us with, usually questions of like emotions or things that just like feel, or questions of life and death, morals, ethics, stuff like that, then I'm pretty flexible on what I define as reality, like something, the backbone of the show I'm creating at the moment, um, the sort of the arc of the character, you might say, is going to be to do with faith, because I was raised. I think it would be not fair to say I was raised atheist, but I was certainly raised without religion, right? And because of that, and going to sort of like a Protestant school, which may as well have been an atheist school, like, and have some scientific knowledge and stuff, and just like thinking very much in terms of logic, reason, objectivity and stuff, it becomes nigh on impossible to just start believing in God, or believing in an afterlife, or believing in, let's not say God, let's say a higher power and all that stuff, like afterlife. Even though as I get older and I've got a son, and relatives are getting older or having died, or some people my own age, which isn't very old, die sometimes by like their own hand, like tragic things occur in life. And I get that some people, and I think they've found their own religion within like atheism, you might say, and say stuff like, oh yeah, well, you just sort of cease to exist and you become part of the land and all that. And I'm like, all right, fair enough, but it seems it's proven psychologically that when you start getting in extreme situations like a life or death situation, you do tend to get a bit more spiritual, right? And like part of me is thinking, oh, it'd be really convenient if I just, I mean, the Stoics talk about, think about bad things before they happen a bit, and it's probably going to help you if they happen. And I'm like, yeah, it'd be so convenient if I just believed in heaven, and it'd be really convenient if I had some sense of a higher power. And then, yeah, discovering or feeling like I discovered that, with my art and stuff, being like, oh, the art feels like better than me. Like the stuff I'm creating goes beyond me. like this thing of art and this thing of I mean, magic, truth be told, is the word I'd use. Like, it feels like my destiny. And I'm like, well, that's a nice, like, that feels like actually kind of pragmatic, because if I come at it with that angle, like from that understanding, I feel like my work's better, because it's sort of like the lens that I allow people to see it through and that I see it through is, polished in such a way that it creates, I mean, a better product might be a way to phrase it, right? And that's me understanding that the art is a higher power. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to like refuse a blood transfusion because of art. Like, I'm not mad. I'm not like, because that's not pragmatic. That's not like a useful version of whatever subjective reality I choose to exist within. Like, it's got to be helpful to me and most people, right? It's got to be virtuous. Makes sense to be so. Otherwise, what's the point, right? When it comes to things like afterlife, I've been talking to a scientist recently, and we're very seriously considering doing a joint project where we see whether or not he's a professor at a university. I won't mention which one, just because, yeah, I don't know if he'd be cool with that. But about, could you do a study whereby you take a group of people who are faithless or atheist or agnostic or whatever, don't have a religion, and have them commit to ritual practice and kind of just pretend that they believe in a higher power for a while and like an afterlife, like a set amount of time, and sort of do daily activities to promote that belief within themselves, and then sort of see afterwards if, similar to a method actor who commits themselves to a role, if you just, I mean, fake it till you make it is what I'm saying, really, isn't it? I think that's a really interesting thought, and I'm starting to kind of like explore that, just sort of self experimentation. Like, if I just choose to believe in an afterlife, will I eventually believe in one? Because it'd be nice to. And if you come to me and say, oh well, science has suggested that's incredibly improbable, it's like, like, who cares? That's not, like, me believing in heaven doesn't mean, again, that I'm not going to have the blood transfusion, or that I'm defying the laws of physics, or that I think the earth is flat. It just means that I've got something where I'm like, well, that just makes me happier. Like, that feels as pragmatic as anything else we've discovered, right? So, I'm trying to find out whether or not your own subjective reality is bendable, and if so, can you make yourself believe in stuff that's helpful? So, yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You kind of mentioned there the sort of fake it till you make it angle. Whenever anybody talks about kind of that, I always think back to Heath Ledger in the 2008 movie The Dark Knight, where he plays the Joker. And he did such an incredible job of being the Joker in that film. People kind of almost believe that he'd kind of gone off the rails, or he was become a darker
Sure.
person because of it. And he kind of talks about it a little bit in a few interviews as well, until he passed away. Um, but it's a really interesting kind of like I don't know, like people often like point to something like that as a moment where somebody got so into a role, not that they actually became the Joker, but that it affected who they were as a person quite drastically. So I do think it's definitely possible to do that sort of stuff. I mean, when people kind of look at a kind of performance art, as we've been discussing this evening, they kind of often point to the sort of like a mystical element that's tied to something like magic, like this, like a veil and there's stuff going on behind the veil and you never quite see it. And it's all kind of sometimes a little bit spooky. So I think it'd be interesting, where we've kind of spoken about rituals and sort of the different roles that we play, whether that be the priest or the doctor, and these different performances that we're all doing. Like I'm doing the performance at the moment of podcast host. But it'd be really interesting just to push in a little bit further into kind of, I guess, how you see the connection between magic and things like mysticism and the occult or the supernatural. Are these all things that are kind of vaguely pointed to through magic and that people can go further into, or actually are they all, when you look at them, kind of hollow and they all kind of are consumed or assumed into this idea of sort of performance ritual? What do you think?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, in one sense, they're fun, right? And whenever you see magic represented in fiction in a sort of like serious, or maybe a better word might be to say a sincere way. And I mean, like, I tend to define magic as sort of like stage magic, which is magicians and stuff that you think of, like, pulling rabbits out of hats and stuff. And then you've got like religious magic, and then you've got fantasy magic. So fantasy magic would be like, Gandalf and Harry Potter. And then religious magic I'd sort of put into, and these aren't great definitions. That I wouldn't put that in a book. This is just for me working. Like religious magic I think of as occult, pagan, crystal healing, esoteric stuff. Um, and I do think that, like, whenever you see a representation of magic in fiction that is sincere, often in horror, because that's one of the sort of big genres where magic comes into play, right? Like, it's usually tarot, occult, it's all of those things, right? Like those things. A lot of that stuff is, just like reminiscent of the, like, sort of late 1800s to early 1900s. Various movements within the Victorian era, which makes sense because people started exploring and felt comfortable exploring different ideas of religion that weren't mainstream, because you weren't being ostracized for it at that particular moment in time. Like, it was pretty fashionable to think of various kind of, like, I mean, the word occult is just like kind of a catch-all term for any sort of religion that's not Christianity. I mean, it speaks to itself, doesn't it? Like as I was saying earlier, magic is a pejorative, right? Like, magic is usually the bad thing, and like a lot of these things, like occult and stuff, they're kind of spoken about in these heavy terms or whatever. But that's just really, I don't say propaganda is a bit of a strong word, but by mainstream religions of saying, and literally pretty much every religious text says, I mean, the Bible's literally, what is it? Leviticus 20. I should know this because it's in my show. Is it Leviticus 20:27? Any man or woman who consults the spirits of the dead shall be stoned to death. Like they don't like other people doing magic if it's not their version of magic, right? So I think those kind of other occult spooky practices are, I mean, fun alternative ways to view religion. I mean, truthfully, like, and my wife always says stuff like this about me, like, because I've not really, found a sort of definite way within my own, like, belief system or whatever to really like, if you're Christian, it's super convenient. There's loads of buildings you can go to, and there's like rituals that are already agreed upon, and there's like a magic book that you can read, and they've got this whole system, and a lot of, pretty much every mainstream religion has. Whereas, like, when you come into things like paganism, or like or occulty, different kinds of belief, they're all just kind of random, and there's no real structure to most things. They say there's a structure, but there's not. Like, there's not. Everyone's got their own kind of version of it. So I think, like, there's value in it, and I think they are kind of, I mean, they're just alternative religions, really, aren't they? They're just alternative belief systems. I'm gonna have a drink of this Capri Sun. They're just and I think that's as far as they'd go. I think they're awesome for storytelling purposes, and I definitely enjoy playing around with ideas within them, for sure.
Yeah, I often think as well, you kind of have this interesting dichotomy within kind of the group and or the in group and the out group. Like, you talk about something like
Yeah,
Christianity, and Leviticus 20:22, or whatever it is you just said. Maybe it's 27. Anyway, you kind of point to these other people over here doing this thing that is shunned and is not okay, but us here doing this stuff where we're kind of killing animals and using the blood to kind of clean the altar to allow ourselves to enter into God's presence. That's totally fine.
yeah,
But like playing with
exactly.
cards, that's bad. It's so
Yeah,
interesting.
like, and I remember one particular instance of people refusing to see magic on religious grounds, and that was when I was doing
Yeah.
card tricks in restaurants.
Wow.
Like,
Wow.
yeah, like, it's mad. Like I say, it's mad. That feels mad because, again, it falls back into my sort of pragmatic thing of, like, this is clearly entertainment, and the fact that you don't feel like this is entertainment, or like, if any, it comes back to that thing of, like, when I'm performing, you want, like, an authentic thing where the audience immediately goes, "Oh, I get this." Like, they didn't allow themselves to attempt to get it because, and I'm not having a go at them, for God's sake. If you don't want to see a card trick, that's fine. I've got nothing against that. It just feels strange that the reason you wouldn't want to see a card trick is because you've got an already held belief that prohibits you from that. And I'm like, guys, it's a card trick. Like, I'm not trying to conjure your dead grandmother here. If I was, fair play. You can have issue with that. But, like, it's the four of clubs. That's not like It is kind of weird, but that just always comes down to insecurity. Like always, pretty much every problem in the world comes down to insecurity, doesn't it? Like if you are insecure in your belief, that is the only reason that you will ever say you're wrong, I'm right. And it's the only reason that if someone does something, behaves in a way that is not the way that you feel comfortable behaving yourself, you go, oh, they are heathen. They are the sorcerers. I'm the priest. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if they were fucking around with like a Ouija board, then that's one thing, right? But like doing some card tricks is
And
totally
but what's
different.
so funny about the Ouija board is like I have relatives who are like uncomfortable with things like that, and I mean, go on, 10 points. What company may popularize the Ouija board?
I have no idea. Absolutely none.
Hasbro.
No.
Hasbro.
Was it?
Yeah,
Shit.
yeah. This is it. Like the
That's
Ouija
amazing.
board. Pretty much the Ouija board. The guy who invented the Ouija board, like the modern, the idea of talking board's quite ancient, but like the modern Ouija board, the guy who invented it, his gravestone is in the shape of a Ouija board. But they sold that idea to a company that eventually became Hasbro, and it was marketed to children as a like ask questions, like not as like a, and then it was used in The Exorcist in 1971, was it?
Oh,
And
that's
then
so fascinating.
that moment was the moment that became, oh, that's like, oh, we don't do that now. And it's because of the movie The Exorcist. And it really speaks further back to the power of the artist, right? The power of that voice, that a movie that was just a bog standard horror movie in the 1970s. I say bog standard, obviously the seminal horror movie, but like still just, a possession horror film that picked a thing like a Ouija board, which was just a children's toy and marketed as such in the movie, and then all of a sudden a religious movement against it, like that feels like, oh, this ancient, I mean, case in point, you yourself, your instinct was to go Ouija board, dangerous, like black magic, not children's toy. The entire perception was changed by one movie in the 1970s. Isn't that mad? Mad.
It's incredible as well. I mean, I guess when you think about horror movies as well, there's always like a kid's toy where its head just slowly rotates
Yeah,
and faces you.
100%.
That's also terrifying. We just had this like when my kids were a little bit younger, we had this sort of like sound tables where they could have like it was in like a grid shape and they would press different buttons and make different sounds and stuff. And as the battery started dying, it would just turn itself on and start making noise at like 2 a.m. That's also quite
Awesome.
terrifying at 2 a.m. These days, it's mainly just me walking on Lego at 2 a.m. I'm like,
Oh,
put it
that is
away,
the
man.
worst
Just put it
pain.
away.
It's the worst pain.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions just to close out the show. I think it'd be interesting just to kind of understand your opinion about the sort of true power of magic. Like, is it the ability to entertain? Is it the ability to inspire? Is it the ability to give wonder to people? Like, what is it for you, David, that is the true power of magic?
I think, I think truthfully a wider question is the true power of art. And I appreciate that obviously, the true power of magic's a valid question to ask me as someone who's performed magic their whole life. But magic is just a facet of art as a whole, I think, And I do feel, to answer that question, it's more practical to think of what is the power of art. And it's easy to belittle that power. In one sense, obviously, it feels like, oh, art is this incredibly powerful thing. But then in another sense, you're getting. I just read an article today that I thought was really interesting about. They called it about like sort of a luxury privilege of certain actors who, actors who talk about acting and like kind of poo-poo it a little bit, and sort of, quite famous actors who are in big movies, sort of saying, oh, acting's just this silly thing we do, and and they thinking, oh, it's just entertainment. And like, well, obviously it can be. But at the end of the day, you know, like like I said, a Ouija board because of a 70s movie. I mean, here's a good example, the post office scandal in the UK. Like, all of these postmasters being imprisoned because of something that turned out to be an IT fault. This unbelievable scandal that happened years ago. And I was aware of it years ago by chance. I heard some Radio 4 thing about it. And like, it was this huge, unbelievably scaled miscarriage of justice that happened to, like, I swear, hundreds, was it 1,000 people or something? Some people in prison, some people killed themselves over it, some people lost all of their money because of it, because of a company cover up, essentially. And a TV show comes out on ITV, like a year ago? A TV show, a work of fiction, based on truth, but all of the words, none of it was verbatim, actors who were playing real people, but only in the sense that they had the same name as the people. Like, really, you know what I mean? And because of that, the next day, nationwide legislation changed to right that wrong. That was a direct art affecting reality. Like, that's what happened, right? Like, that is the potential of storytelling, you know? And magic, like, okay, let's try and be specific about magic. Magic, as a facet of that, I don't know, because like I feel like magic in its essence, and I mentioned this a bit in the TEDx talk, is sort of akin to, it's a mechanical device that's designed to produce a specific emotional response. That's how I see it. Same as a joke gets a laugh, a jump scare gets a scare, clues in the name, a fright, whatever you want to call it. And magic gets wonder or amazement. So you wonder, amazement, and I talk about like these sort of being subsets of the emotion awe, but really, like, or a plot twist can get you in a similar fashion to magic. Like, they're all just mechanical devices which on their own are parlor tricks, but when told within the context of a story, they become like it transcends, like do you know, I was thinking about a movie the other day, Shawshank Redemption, which is widely considered one of the greatest movies ever made and tops the IMDb list, or at least used to, but I'm pretty sure still does. And I often thought, oh yeah, it's a brilliant movie, I remember watching it as a kid. And then I watched it recently and something hit me. I was like, oh my god, the end of Shawshank Redemption. And if you've not seen it, pause the video now, go watch Shawshank Redemption, because this will be a bit of a spoiler. But at the end of it, there's this big reveal about, oh, all of these things that happened over the course of this movie, the behavior of that character, as it turns out, were all him plotting to escape, right? And then at the end, you see how all of those little things helped him escape. And in one sense, it's a plot twist. In another sense, it's a magic trick. In another sense, it's a joke that he was playing on all of the other characters. Like, there's a lot of different ways you can frame it, but it's the same mechanical process where it's essentially something is happening and I don't understand what it is. I then reveal what the nature of that was at the end, and you get that in your brain, that moment as the viewer, that moment of clarity, where all of a sudden it's like, I see how story A and story B connects now. And that feeling, it'll be wonder, it could be a laugh, it could be a scare, it could be anything. It's a mechanical process, an element of the craft. When that is combined with authenticity within a story, that will, like, it is proven that that will alter reality. So, yeah, I'd say the answer to that question is it has the power to be whatever the word, like, however you might define real magic. Like, we think of real magic, fantasy magic, as a wizard snaps their fingers and the world around them is somehow changes. The fire lights, or the staff lights up, or whatever. Like, art literally does that. Art literally alters reality. Like, it doesn't break the subjective pragmatic laws of physics, doesn't have to. Doesn't have to. Just nudges everything along a little bit. So there, yeah, deep.
I love it. No, it's great. I guess we've spoken a lot today about ritual, about your kind of performances and kind of what you think different things are. But I think to close, it'd be interesting to ask, what is it that you hope your audience walk away from your shows holding on to over the weeks that follow? What is it that you're trying to impart to people?
There's a book. I wish I had it here. I've got it in my living room. I've got first edition of it. I mentioned earlier, called Our Magic by Devant and Maskelyne, two great magicians. And when I read it during lockdown, there was this bit in it, and I was like, bloody hell, this is a magic book. It doesn't really teach magic tricks. It talks about the art form, where the guy says there's three kinds of art. There's false art, which is when you copy someone else. There's good art, which is when you do an already existing thing, but in your own way. And there's high art, when you create something totally new. And he says, aim for good, always. Because sometimes, maybe, one time out of a million, you might fluke high. but you'll never get it if that's what you're trying to do. Just focus on good. And that has stayed with me. What I want my audience, this is absolute genuine honesty, what I want my audience to feel, right, when they leave my show, is that they have enjoyed it as much as they have enjoyed an all-right film. That's it, which seems like I'm setting the bar really low. But truthfully, for a show that has magic in it, that feels like quite a high bar. Because I don't know about you, but I do not watch magic recreationally. No one does, really, except maybe some magicians. And even then, most of them don't. What I do watch is movies or TV shows, or I'll read books. You know, those are the art that is the most accessible to me. Like literally and figuratively. And I love movies so much. I just love good or video games, maybe. Really good stories that just drag you in, immerse you in the narrative. You know what I mean? Like, that's good. And I don't even have to watch it doesn't have to be the greatest film ever made. Just something that I think, oh, that's baller, that's really good. Like John Carpenter's The Fog. It's not the best John Carpenter movie. It's not even close to being the best horror movie. It's not even close to being a great movie. It's pretty good, though. It's pretty good, and I have a really good time watching it. If an audience member left my show and went, oh, I really enjoyed that. That was great. And then maybe a few weeks later thinks back to it and goes, oh, wasn't that good? That was good, wasn't it? I am happy. Like, if I could do that, man, that's what I aim for. So, yeah.
Amazing. David, there'll be links to your website and socials and that TEDx talk that I mentioned as well in the description. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today, mate. Thank you so much for your time and for
I really
answering all these
appreciate
questions.
Thank you. No, it's genuine. I love talking. So, no, thank you, dude. Like, a genuine pleasure.
Cheers. Thanks for checking out this episode. If you enjoyed it and are on YouTube or Rumble, please like, subscribe, and then hit the bell notification icon so you never miss a new episode. And don't forget to check out our community over on Locals. Cheers.